So in the 1920s, early 1920s, a group of major breweries got together and decided to amalgamate into one large company, New Zealand Breweries, which ultimately became Lion Breweries. It was mainly driven by Speight's Brewery in Dunedin.
The key driver for the 1923 amalgamation with the 10 major breweries around the country, I think, was to fight the anti-liquor sort of, or the prohibitionist view that was predominant around the end of the First World War.
One of the other major effects of the threat of prohibition was the forming of New Zealand Breweries in 1923. This was a cartel, if you like, of 10 breweries that got together because they saw the threat of prohibition and they decided they needed to join forces in order to fight it better.
It was also an opportunity to give the public a way of being involved in the industry through shareholdings. I guess the key architect for it was a guy called Alfred Bankhart. He drove the process along with guys like Charles Speight, Charles Lewis and Elliot Davis from Auckland. So they were very key to the formation of the company. And Speight's was the key, being the largest brewery of the 10.
In some ways, the formation of New Zealand Breweries to fight one negative cause in terms of prohibition ended up causing another negative in terms of the duopoly that we ended up with.
Probably it could be said that one of the drivers for the merger, or one of the drivers for Myers's interest in the merger, was the fact that he had decided by this time to live in London. And in 1921, after he resigns from Parliament, he went to London, and he comes back in 1923 and really starts to wrap up his assets. His family, who are members, are beneficiaries of old Uncle Louis's estate, get big dividends from the company, and Myers himself takes a significant chunk of the investment. And since he goes back to England and his health is increasingly uncertain, it really makes sense to form a bigger enterprise.
Approaching 50, his wife, I think on marriage, she had a commitment from him that they'd go back to England, and she held him to it, and they went back, and he died when he was 59. And I don't think he enjoyed being back in England. I think he was really quite lonely, and to a degree probably died of a bit of a broken heart from being separated from New Zealand.
Dominion Breweries, which is the second largest brewery in New Zealand and has been Lion's main rival for the best part of 70, 80 years, started out at the height of the temperance movement in 1929 as the Waitemata Brewery.
The government was finally persuaded to give another brewing licence, and they gave it to the Coots brothers, who were well-known brewers, and that became Dominion Brewery. There was a lot of opposition to it. The Women's Temperance Union and others, prohibitionist groups, were very upset by it, but the government persisted with the licence. The Women's Temperance Union met in the Baptist Church in Otahu, and they marched down towards the brewery and stood outside while the brewers were having their grand opening inside and drinking beer. And the women prayed that this factory would be turned into a food factory and not produce alcohol.
The opening of the brewery was marked by a massive protest from the temperance movement, many of whom were said to have been paid to be there by New Zealand Breweries, heralding a rivalry between two groups that would last for the entire length of the 20th century.
One of the prohibitionist protesters was jailed, was taken down and put in cells, and Sir Ernest Davies, I think it was, who was then head of New Zealand Breweries and became Mayor of Auckland and was a very influential man, like a lot of brewers, and a friend of his went down and bailed this man out. They felt that it was unfair that because he had protested he'd been put into jail.
Dominion Breweries was formed when two guys got together. Henry Kelliher, he was a Gallipoli veteran, a keen businessman and an arts patron, and he joined forces with William Cootes.
The Cootes brothers, with Morton as a very accomplished brewer, when they set up Dominion Breweries, they didn't realise the difficulty that they would have in establishing a network of outlets. And they were in danger of failing when along came Sir Henry Kelliher, who was a very astute businessman. He took over the management and control of Dominion Breweries and left the Morton Cootes the job of making the beer. In fact, Sir Henry was a very light drinker.
Kelliher was the businessman, Cootes was the brewer. Kelliher wanted Cootes to make the kind of beer he'd seen in Europe, a sparkling, clear beer. And what they produced was known as Waitemata Sparkling Ale, and it became a bit of a cult beer in the 1930s, 1940s, especially with students, and that launched DB onto the map. But for a long time they were known as the Little Battler because they were in rivalry with the giant conglomerate known as New Zealand Breweries. But one of the tricks that they did, or one of the PR exercises if you like, was to send beer to the New Zealand troops fighting in the Second World War. And this won them a lot of friends and a lot of favours and helped make them a force in the latter half of the 20th century.
Well, as you walk into the door, we've got the saying up on the wall, the impossible is only that which we've not yet learned to do. And that really was what Morton Cootes was about. He was always trying new things. He never gave up. Right to probably to the end of his life, he never gave up on trying to develop new things for brewing. And I believe he even had a patent for a barley wine that he was trying to get patented at the time of his, around about the time of his death when he was reached 100. He was a marvellous man in that respect. I only worked with him in his latter days at the company. Of course, I was very young, and he would have been in his 80s, I suppose. And I found him a very nice person to work with. Well, when the Waitemata Brewery was built and it started being developed, the second stage was to expand the brewery and build another bigger brewery, and he made it what they call the model brewery, and that's the one that's got the Zeeman brew plant in it, and that had cool ships at the top. It was very classic German, which probably remains probably the best example of a classic old Zeeman brew house. Was built in 1938. And that was before the war. In fact, the German people that were installing it had to go into an internment camp when the war started. They had that type of brewing technology all the way through until the late 40s, when new styles of fermentation were starting to evolve around different parts of the world. Morton saw this and he wanted to be a part of it, so he started looking at tall tank fermentation and all that, and he found that our particular yeast flocculated quite rapidly, and the only way he could actually keep it in suspension long enough was to stir it, and hence from there he evolved his continuous fermentation system.
A very interesting man, but he was totally obsessed with monetary reform. And if I had a conversation, and I had many of them with Sir Henry, we might start off on anything, but within 10 minutes we were talking about monetary reform.
His office was around where the district court is now in Albert Street. I remember being summoned there to see the old man, and finding that all he really wanted to do was to give me a lecture on monetary reform and what amounted to sort of an early form of social credit. And I had to endure this lecture and finally escaped
But he was obsessed by this, but a very astute businessman, a very shrewd businessman. And he was the pivotal factor in the success of Dominion Breweries.
One of his assistants told of the old man lugging bags of compost around in the back of his Rolls Royce, for Pete's sake, and trees and things, and getting out with a spade and planting the trees. "Don't tell my wife, don't tell my wife," he would say. And so he's all at once a very keen businessman, but decidedly eccentric.
Well, I started off by acquiring, in the first instance, I acquired a hotel. I was going to buy a farm. I'd practically bought it, a sheep run in the Wairarapa. And a friend of mine, who was also a hotel broker and land agent, suggested I should buy a hotel at Carson, which I purchased.
And our beers in New Zealand are typically 4%. That happened during the war. The fact that for us to be able to supply beer to the American troops, I think an agreement was made that we would make beers at 4% rather than at 5%. So we ended up by making beers at 4%, and I think Australia stayed at 5%.
Later, you went into the ministry. So, was there a sort of religious atmosphere in your house?
Oh, yes,
your
very
father and your
definitely.
mother? Yes,
both. They were both religious. My mother particularly so. It was wrong to whistle on Sunday. It was wrong to dance. It was several things were wrong, which are accepted as quite proper today. It was very much of a Puritan home, if I may put it that way.
But was it a happy, loving sort of home?
Yes, it was, perhaps with some of the exceptions that occur in normal married lives. I was very much influenced by my mother.
For the Anzacs, the transit centre was Brussels, and so they landed in Belgium before going on to England. The High Commissioner had come from London to greet the liberated men. Mr. Jordan shares with them their first real beer in years.
You're a bit thin on it, old sport. So had you been. You had a 600-mile route match.
You must have been keen.
The Huns were keen, not us. But what about the boxing? You going to take that up again when you get back?
I'm afraid that's out, Ken. I was working in a German coal mine and injured my left hand. Still, I can train a few of the young lads when I get back.
Did you hurt your elbow too?
No, why?
Well, come on over to the Dirty Duck and we'll have one.
I could do with a beer myself.
And for quite a long time, the price tribunal governed the price of beer, and it was a very sore point among men when the price of beer was increased. And I can remember as a young reporter when there were even arguments about whether your 8-ounce glass was full or not. And there was even a talk about having a Plimsoll mark around the top of the glass so that you got your full 8 ounces. So it was a very serious matter. But on the West Coast in 1947, the price for beer was increased by the price tribunal from 6p to 7p for a 10-ounce beer. Now the West Coast miners were a very rabid mob, and they decided they would ban beer, which was highly unlikely, highly unlikely. But one hotel in Greymouth stayed open, so he did fantastic business. And the brewers got very upset by this, and of course the other hotels did as well. And it was so serious that there were a couple of cases where miners went to hotels where the price had been increased and they lost their jobs. They were banned from the union. This was not kids' stuff. After a while, the brewers decided that they would not send beer to this hotel. So the Northern Transport, or the Transport Workers Union, became involved and said, if you do that, we won't transport beer anywhere. So it then went to the cabinet, of course, and they had a cabinet meeting on how to solve this problem. And the Labor government was fully aware of the fact that all the miners voted Labor, so they had this colossal problem. They decided in the end, very tactfully, a lot of pressure on Peter Fraser, they decided in the end, very tactfully, that they would allow an extension of licenses to clubs. So the Greymouth miners immediately bought 2 houses, put them together and started to be a club. And there were 2 other clubs started. And I always remember that one of the miners' leaders down there was asked why it was called the Greymouth Drinking and Arts Club. And he was asked what it had to do with arts. And he said, down here, my man, drinking is an art form.
But on a hot day, a man feels like something longer and stronger than a cup of tea.
Oh, she's a real good looker.
Here's another one, Bob.
Why, man, she only cost me 12 quid, and she'll be the cheapest and the best cow I
The
brought.
bar in the local pub is an amiable meeting place for men from all over the valley. Over a beer with young Bill, Harold offers to take him fishing the following Sunday.
In Queen Street, light frocks and coats off is the fashion. A heat and some cool refreshment. And a little quiet recreation to accompany it. Auckland's heat wave lifted the consumption of beer to a Christmas holiday level, and it must have needed all of the 1 million bottles a week put out to quench the city's thirst.
After 1955, it was evident that dairy produce and wool prices were on the way down, and when the new Labour administration came into office under Walter Nash, they were confronted with this situation, and they were anxious to implement the promises that they'd made about improving social services such as health and education. And in the budget, now described as the black budget, they did make provision for quite a substantial increase in expenditure. Mr. Nordmeyer, who had assumed office as Minister of Finance, felt obliged, having been determined to introduce these expenditure increases, to offset these increases and more by increasing taxation. He increased income tax, he increased the tax on beer, which of course is not a popular thing to do in any country, and on other commodities.
So Steinlager came about because of Nordmeyer's black budget. He basically upped the import beer excise costs, and that made it almost unsustainable for companies to bring imported beer into the country. So Lion looked at that, or New Zealand Breweries Limited as it was in the time, and said let's create a European-style Pilsner lager for the New Zealand market.
For a long time in New Zealand, Steinlager was something of a national beer that we didn't really have.
A guy called Ron Mitford Burgess was the brewer who helped develop that, and that was created in 1958. It was originally named Steinecker, and it was named Steinecker because that was the name of the brew houses that we'd bought from Germany, from a company called Steinecker. And they were only too happy for us to use the name Steinecker as the name of our new beer. It had the nice German cues in terms of the European style lager, and that was important in terms of marketing the product to the consumers in that time.
But bizarrely enough, when Steinlager first came out, it was regarded in some circles as a slightly effeminate drink. This is because people didn't really know how to handle a European style lager. It was in contrast to their big 750ml brown bottles of Lion Red and DB Draft.
When I was a young fellow, a teenager in the 1950s, that New Zealand beer was about 3.8 to 4%. And really it was the arrival of Steinlager and DB Export that saw the strength raised to 5%. Now, even that's quite mild by Belgian standards, where 9% is not uncommon.
It took Doug Myers at Lion to see that they needed to leverage the beer differently to create a different image for it that eventually propelled it into the position we now know.
The name change came about from a legal action from Heineken. Heineken was unhappy that the label to them was passing off Heineken. They took that to court, and Heineken was successful in having their complaint upheld. So as a basis of that, we then changed it from Steinecker to Steinlager. It was also the first beer where we had a decorated crown seal, and we had a particularly a special bottle made called a Steiny bottle, which was a 345ml, or in those days called a pint bottle. We put Steinlager into green bottles in 1977, so from 58 right through till 1977 it was always in brown glass, and there's a good reason we put beer in brown glass, and that's to protect it from light. When we started to go into the USA and the mainland of USA particularly, green glass was seen to be the appropriate package to go in, because we were competing against beers like Heineken, and so therefore we made the decision to put Steinlager into green glass.
Of course, perhaps a low point in your political career as far as the public was concerned, with the publishing of your black budget of 1958. And can I call it infamous?
Oh, you may. It's been called worse than that, I tell you. I don't regard it as a black budget at all. My budget was very mild. Well, I think the greatest controversy was caused over the increase in beer prices. There were other features of the budget which some people didn't like, but there wasn't the same objection to them as there was to the raising of beer taxes. Now, my own feeling was that at that time, what I did was the proper course to take. And actually, the later years, I think, vindicated my budget because we got onto a very even keel in 1960 And unfortunately, from that time, we appear to have degenerated since.